I remember the smell before the pain. The bitter reek of bourbon clung to the air, sharp and acidic, invading my lungs even before Harold Carter's hands closed around my throat. His fingers dug into the sides of my neck with a cruel precision, pressing against the fragile pulse beneath my skin. My stepdad's grip was not sloppy or uncertain. It was steady and deliberate, as if he had been waiting for this moment all evening. My back slammed into the edge of the sofa, the wooden armrest biting into my ribs. The sound of picture frames rattling against the wall followed, echoing in rhythm with his shouts. His face hovered inches from mine, red and swollen from liquor sweat dripping down his temple. His eyes were glassy yet fierce, two small bonfires fueled by anger and alcohol. "Where's the insurance money your father left?" he roared. His words were not a question. They were a demand. His spit landed on my cheek as he leaned closer, tightening his grip until the edges of my vision flickered. My lungs clawed for air. I could not draw a full breath, only shallow gulps that burned. My nails scraped at his wrist, but he did not budge. To him, I was not a stepdaughter, not even a person. I was an obstacle standing between him and the $250,000 that had been meant for me when my father died. From the corner of the room, I heard my mother's whimper. Donna Anderson stood near the kitchen doorway, clutching the hem of her sweater with trembling hands. Her eyes darted between us wide with fear. But when Harold snapped his head in her direction, she froze. "Stay out of this," he barked. She lowered her gaze to the floor as if her silence could erase her presence. The air grew heavier. My chest heaved against his grip. My heartbeat thundered so violently it felt as if it might burst through my ribs. Each beat pounded against his palm like a desperate drum. I tried to form words to tell him I had no money, that he had already taken everything, but only a strangled rasp escaped my lips. Then came the sound of laughter, soft, mocking, poisonous. Madison, his daughter, leaned against the wall with her phone raised high, its lens glinting in the dim light. "Smile, Lily," she said with a smirk. "This one is going online." Her voice was calm, almost amused, as though the violence unfolding before her was nothing more than entertainment. Humiliation struck harder than his fists. My stepsister's camera turned my suffering into a spectacle. I wanted to scream, to tear the phone from her hand, but my body was failing. My arms trembled, my vision blurred, the room tilting sideways. My lips tasted of salt and iron where his grip had forced the blood vessels beneath my skin to burst. My mother's sobs filled the silence, faint and powerless. "Harold, please," she whispered. Her plea was swallowed by his ragged breathing and my muffled gasps. He leaned closer, his breath hot against my ear. "You think you can keep things from me? You think you can live without my permission? You are nothing." Darkness pressed in from the edges of my sight. My pulse raced and then staggered, skipping beats each pause long enough to terrify me. My chest convulsed, desperate for oxygen that would not come. The coarse carpet beneath me scratched my knees as I fell forward, my strength ebbing. My hands clawed at the floor, searching for stability, for anything that might tether me to consciousness. Harold's shadow loomed above me, massive and merciless. The world around him blurred, his voice muffled as though shouted underwater. My mother's outline remained frozen near the doorway, her tears shining in the low light. Madison's phone hovered like an executioner's blade, capturing every second of my collapse. The beating of my heart turned chaotic, a rhythm of panic and despair. It surged violently, then paused, then surged again. Each hollow silence felt like the end. My chest tightened further, the breath rattling in my throat, shallow and sharp. My body shook uncontrollably, not just from lack of air, but from the cold realization that I might never rise again. The taste of copper filled my mouth. I tried to push myself upward, but my arms gave way. I crumpled sideways, my cheek pressing into the carpet. The fibers scratched against the blood at the corner of my lip. My vision tunneled, leaving only the distorted image of Harold's sneer and the faint glimmer of Madison's recording phone. In that final moment of clarity before unconsciousness swallowed me, one thought pulsed through my mind: this could be the end. The man who had stolen my father's money and my mother's voice was about to steal the last thing I had left my life. Then, everything went black. When I opened my eyes again, the room was silent. I was lying on my bed, though I did not remember walking there. My throat ached, raw and swollen, each swallow scraping like broken glass. The faint hum of the ceiling fan filled the silence, mocking in its calmness. A bottle of cheap painkillers and a glass of water sat on the nightstand left by my mother. Not an ambulance, not a doctor, just the quiet command to swallow the pills and keep living. I reached for the lock on my door that night. My hand shook, but I turned it with deliberate force. The click of metal sliding into place echoed louder than Harold's threats. In the darkness, I whispered to myself, barely audible but firm, "Silence will not save me anymore." When I was 10 years old, my world ended in a single phone call. My father, Robert Anderson, had been working late at a construction site when a crane malfunctioned and collapsed. By the time the paramedics reached him, he was gone. What remained was the faint smell of sawdust clinging to his jacket, a toolbox that still sits in the corner of our garage, and a life insurance policy worth $250,000. That money was supposed to be my security net, a legacy from a man who believed in hard work and who loved me without conditions. My mother, Donna, was devastated. She was quiet by nature, gentle, often humming while folding laundry, but grief stripped her down to something fragile. She could barely function, and in those months after the funeral, she seemed to float from day to day in a fog of sorrow. Bills piled up, mortgage statements arrived with red stamps across the front. At church one Sunday, she met Harold Carter, a man with broad shoulders, a booming voice, and a Bible tucked under his arm. He told her she was beautiful when she cried, told her she needed a strong man to protect her and guide the family. Within a year, they were married. Harold insisted on managing the insurance money. He told my mother, "It is not safe for a woman to handle finances alone." At first, it sounded like concern, but soon it was control. He persuaded her to deposit everything into a joint account. He called it an investment in family stability. In reality, he used it to buy a new truck to drink top-shelf bourbon when he entertained his friends and to shower his daughter Madison with gifts. I remember the day he brought home an iPhone for her 12th birthday. She squealed with delight while I stood empty-handed in the corner clutching a notebook that had cost me less than $1. My mother tried to justify it. "He wants Madison to feel secure," she whispered, but her eyes avoided mine, already ashamed of the inequality. From then on, the roles in the house were carved deep. Harold was the provider and ruler. Madison was the princess, and I was the burden. Harold rarely spoke my name. He referred to me as the girl or worse, extra mouth. At dinner, he would sometimes laugh and say feeding me was like throwing money into a fire. Guests chuckled nervously, but no one challenged him. Donna sat in silence, her knuckles white against her fork. Harold claimed he was preparing me for real life, but it was a campaign of erasure. He barred me from after-school jobs, insisting chores were my duty. When I won small scholarships from writing contests, he demanded the checks and said he would manage them responsibly. I never saw that money again. He canceled my health insurance, claiming it was too expensive. When I twisted my ankle during gym class, he forced my mother to pay cash at the clinic. She cried quietly while handing over the bills, then told me not to complain because Harold was under pressure. He controlled every dollar, every decision. My mother withered beneath his rules. She had once read bedtime stories in a gentle voice. Now she spoke Harold's words back to me as if repeating them could make them true. Without him, we would have nothing, she told me. Sometimes I wondered if she believed it or if she had been worn down into compliance. Harold's daughter Madison thrived in the environment. She learned quickly that she could do no wrong in his eyes. He spoiled her with expensive clothes, hair appointments, and trips to the mall. When she made mistakes at school, he blamed the teachers. When I succeeded, he claimed I must have cheated. Madison saw me as competition for attention she never actually lacked. She spread rumors at school that I was pathetic, that even my own family did not want me. Her words cut deeper because they were rooted in the truth of our home. I hid in my notebooks writing stories about girls who escaped cages and built new lives. I imagined myself in their skin, free from the suffocating presence of Harold's authority. But he caught me once scribbling lines of poetry and sneered. No one pays for poems. Stop wasting time and scrub the floors. He threw my notebook into the trash. I pulled it out later, the pages smudged with grease and coffee, but the damage was already done. Writing became my secret rebellion, something fragile I clung to in the shadows. Our neighbor, Evelyn, sometimes glanced at me with a look that suggested she knew more than she said. She had heard shouting through the walls, but Harold's public mask was convincing. He shook hands firmly, volunteered at church picnics, and told everyone he was raising 2 girls with discipline and love. People nodded approvingly, blind to the truth. Inside the house, my mother's silence was constant. She rarely challenged Harold, and when she did, his raised voice sent her shrinking back into herself. She suffered from what I later learned to call battered woman syndrome, a learned helplessness born from years of intimidation and fear. To outsiders, she looked like a woman who chose obedience. To me, she looked like someone trapped in chains only she could feel. By the time I turned 16, I understood that my father's insurance money was gone. Harold never admitted it outright, but the new truck, the endless bottles, the gifts for Madison told the story. Whenever I asked, he snapped that money belonged to him because he was the man of the house. My mother's eyes filled with tears, but she never contradicted him. That silence told me everything I needed to know. My father's legacy had been stolen, and so had my place in this family. I was not simply unloved. I was unwanted. This was the foundation of the life I lived for 12 years, a household built not on care, but on domination. Every laugh, every cruel word, every stolen dollar chipped away at my identity, until I began to believe I was invisible. Yet deep inside, a stubborn ember remained. It whispered that my story was not over, that I had been meant for more than silence. I would cling to that ember even when Harold's grip tightened around my throat. Years later, even when the world narrowed to a tunnel of black, that ember would become the difference between surrender and survival. Harold Carter's reign over our household was not loud in the way outsiders might expect. It was not constant shouting or fists flying every day. It was quieter, more insidious, the steady erosion of freedom disguised as order. He controlled every dollar that entered the house. When I was old enough to want a part-time job, he forbade it, insisting that chores were my duty and that working outside would distract me from being useful at home. He did not want me to earn even a small measure of independence. My stepsister Madison, on the other hand, lived as if the world existed to serve her. Harold bought her clothes that shimmered in the light, a car when she turned 16, and the newest phone the week it hit the stores. She flaunted her privileges with a cruel smile, reminding me at every turn that I had nothing. At school, she would laugh with her friends and whisper loud enough for me to hear that I was pathetic, that my family only kept me around out of pity. The whispers grew into a nickname, Extra Mouth. She repeated it at the dinner table until Harold chuckled and repeated it himself. Soon, it felt like my identity had been reduced to those 2 words. My mother, Donna, said little. She moved through the house like a shadow, quiet, careful, avoiding Harold's anger. Once, I overheard her whispering to a neighbor that she wished things were different, but when Harold confronted her later, she backtracked, insisting she had never spoken against him. I recognized the pattern of fear, though I did not have a name for it then. She was trapped by dependence, by years of gaslighting, by the belief that without him she could not survive. I hated her silence more than Harold's cruelty. His violence was sharp and clear. Her silence was slow poison, convincing me I was not worth defending. Harold reinforced his authority in small humiliations. He took the family photos himself and always angled the camera to exclude me. On holidays, he bought gifts for Madison and Donna, but handed me nothing. If relatives asked about me, he would wave them off. "She is just another expense," he would say with a smirk. My mother never contradicted him. Once at a barbecue, I forgot to bring napkins outside. In front of neighbors, he grabbed my arm so hard I thought it would snap and shook me until the world blurred. He snarled that I was incompetent while guests pretended not to notice. Later, he laughed it off, telling them he was only teaching discipline. The shame burned deeper than the bruise. He seemed to take pleasure not just in hurting me, but in making me small before others. Madison delighted in it. She would crumple my essays, sneer at my cooking, accuse me of stealing her clothes. Harold always took her side. "She tries harder," he would say, as though my existence was a constant failing. I learned to make myself small, to walk softly, to speak only when spoken to. I wore long sleeves to cover bruises. I smiled at school even when my stomach ached from skipped meals. I told teachers I was fine, though I felt invisible. I became practiced at shrinking until I felt like I no longer took up space at all. Yet there were cracks in Harold's perfect facade. Our neighbor Evelyn sometimes watched from across the fence. Her sharp eyes followed me when I carried bruises that makeup could not quite hide. She never confronted Harold directly, but her gaze lingered heavy with suspicion. I felt both fear and a flicker of comfort knowing someone outside the house sensed the truth. Inside, however, the toxic rhythm continued. Harold's words carried the weight of law. Donna obeyed, Madison flourished, and I endured. He stripped away privacy as well as dignity. He searched my backpack, rifled through my drawers, demanded receipts for anything I bought with change I collected from couch cushions. Meals were punishments. Madison would scrape her leftovers onto my plate with a grin, telling me that was all I was worth. If I refused, Harold would slam his hand on the table until I ate every bite. My mother's soft pleas, "Harold, please enough," held no weight. His glare silenced her instantly. Night after night, I lay in bed listening to him pace the hallway, shouting about bills or accusing me of laziness. I learned to stay awake, to breathe quietly, to brace myself. The house became a cage where every step was calculated for survival. The bitterest truth was that the cage was invisible to outsiders. At church, Harold smiled, shook hands, volunteered to grill hamburgers at picnics. People praised his discipline, his generosity. Donna stood beside him with a polite smile. Madison beamed, and I stood slightly apart, the ghost daughter unseen. That duality hollowed me out. In public, we looked like a family. At home, we were a kingdom ruled by fear. Still, there was one stubborn ember that refused to die. It glowed faintly in the moments Ethan Miller, a boy in my literature class, asked about my writing. He treated me as if my words mattered. When everyone else dismissed me, he listened. Those small moments stitched together pieces of my broken confidence. I guarded them like treasure. They were proof that I was more than Harold's punching bag or Madison's scapegoat. Yet returning home after those glimpses of kindness made the contrast brutal. Harold barked orders the moment I stepped through the door. Madison accused me of theft. Donna whispered apologies that meant nothing. Each insult carved away at me. Each day convinced me more that my role was to disappear. And yet deep inside, the ember smoldered. It whispered that one day the silence would break. One day I would not just survive, but resist. For now, though, I remained inside Harold's toxic empire, living a double life. At school, I was a quiet girl with hidden bruises. At home, I was invisible, existing only as the target of contempt. That was the reality of our family. A house built not on love or respect, but on domination, control, and erasure. The letter arrived on a warm afternoon, its envelope thin but heavy with promise. My hands shook as I tore it open, standing in the narrow hallway where dust drifted in shafts of sunlight. It was from the university, a scholarship award letter for $5,000. It was not enough to cover everything, but it was mine. Proof that my words and grades had value. Proof that I could carve out a future beyond Harold's house. I pressed the letter to my chest, heart racing with hope. For a moment, the cage around me cracked. I hid it carefully between the pages of my notebook, sliding the cover shut as if protecting treasure. That night, I dreamed of classrooms far from Harold's voice of writing, without fear of a life where my name was not extra mouth, but Lily Anderson again. The dream did not last. Harold had a nose for control, a predator's instinct for sniffing out anything that threatened his dominance. A week later, I returned from school to find him seated in his worn armchair, the envelope already in his hand. My stomach dropped. His face was flushed with drink, eyes narrow. He waved the letter like a weapon. "What is this?" His voice was sharp enough to slice through bone. I tried to explain, my voice trembling. "It is a scholarship. I earned it. It will help me study." He cut me off with a laugh that was more a growl. "All money belongs to the man of the house." His words echoed against the walls. My mother Donna stood at the sink, wringing her hands, whispering, "Please, Harold, let it go." He turned on her venom in his glare. "Stay out of this or you will be next." She froze, her lips sealed as tears brimmed in her eyes. Madison appeared in the doorway, phone in hand, her smirk already carved into her face. She loved these moments when my humiliation became entertainment. "Smile, Lily." She mocked, raising the camera. My cheeks burned with both shame and fury, but I forced my jaw shut. Harold crumpled the letter and hurled it at my chest. The paper struck like a stone, its weight heavier than it should have been. "You think you can make plans without me?" His roar filled the room. I swallowed hard, my pulse racing. Something inside me rebelled against the silence that had always been my shield. "It is my scholarship," I whispered, voice shaking. "I earned it." The room went still, everyone shocked that I had dared to speak. Harold's face, twisted veins bulging at his temple. In 2 strides, he was on me. His hand clamped around my arm, yanking me forward so hard I stumbled into the coffee table. Pain shot through my shoulder. I tried to pull free, but his fist came down across my cheek with a sickening crack. The world spun. I fell to the carpet, my palms scraping against the coarse fibers. Warmth spread in my mouth where my teeth had torn the inside of my lip. Blood dribbled down my chin. My heart slammed against my ribs in a frantic rhythm. Madison's laughter rang above me, the camera lens gleaming. "This is gold," she whispered. My mother sobbed behind her hand, whispering broken pleas that carried no power. Harold loomed above me, chest heaving. "Respect," he bellowed the word, striking harder than his fists. "Respect is what you owe me." He kicked at my side, the air rushing from my lungs. I curled inward, trying to protect my ribs, tears stinging my eyes. My chest burned as my heartbeat surged faster and faster, then stumbled, skipping each pause, terrifying. Darkness threatened to close in, but I clung to the flicker of defiance that had escaped my lips. Even as the world tilted, even as Harold's rage shook the walls, I knew a line had been crossed. I had spoken. I had claimed something as mine. The punishment was brutal, but the ember of resistance glowed hotter. On the carpet breath, shallow and ragged, I realized silence would never save me again. When I woke the next morning, my body felt like a map of bruises, each one pulsing its own rhythm of pain. My cheek was swollen, my ribs ached with every breath, and my throat burned from where Harold's hands had pressed the night before. On the nightstand sat a cheap bottle of Tylenol and a half glass of water left by my mother, who had not dared to call a doctor. That was her way of coping, offering silent tokens instead of real protection. I dragged myself to the mirror and nearly recoiled at the face staring back. My eye was ringed with purple, my lip cracked, and there was a faint outline of Harold's fingers along my neck. For a long moment, I stared at myself and whispered, "If I do not resist, I will die before 25. It was the clearest thought I had ever had. That night, while Harold snored in the living room with an empty bottle dangling from his hand, I pulled out an old phone I had hidden in a shoebox beneath my bed. It had no service, but the microphone still worked. I tested it, whispering into the speaker, then played it back. The sound was faint, but clear. That was enough. I tucked it beneath a loose floorboard where only I would know, and from that day forward, I carried it like a secret weapon. The first time I pressed record was the very next morning. Harold barked from the kitchen, demanding breakfast. I kept my head down, scrambled eggs, set the plate in front of him, and as he shoved the fork into his mouth, he muttered, "Useless girl, can't even cook properly." My pocket vibrated with the hidden phone catching every word. Madison laughed, tossing her hair back, and shoved her unfinished toast onto my plate. "That's all you're worth?" she sneered. I forced myself to eat each bite, tasting of humiliation and ash, but I wrote it down later in my notebook with the time and date. I began keeping records of everything small and large. The nights when Harold paced the hallway shouting about bills, the mornings when Madison accused me of stealing her makeup, the moments when my mother whispered apologies but did nothing. I filled page after page with the evidence of my life, the bruises that would fade but could be preserved in words. Harold must have sensed something was shifting because his grip on the house grew tighter. He began rifling through my backpack after school, demanding to see my notebooks, questioning why I spent time alone in my room. Once he stormed in without knocking, pulling open drawers and slamming them shut when he found nothing. "You think you are clever, but I see everything," he growled, his eyes bloodshot. My heart pounded so loud I thought he could hear it, terrified he might stumble upon the phone hidden under the floorboard. When he finally left, I collapsed against the door, shaking with relief, but also with pride that he had found nothing. His suspicion did not fade, though. He started confiscating any coins I saved, claiming I was untrustworthy with money. He demanded receipts for every item I owned, sneering when I could not provide one. Meals became harsher. Madison would deliberately spill food onto my lap, laughing, as Harold told me to clean it up. If I refused, he slammed his fist on the table until the silverware rattled. "Eat what you are given," he barked, and my mother's weak protests dissolved under his glare. I endured it all, but inside the ember of resistance grew. Every insult I recorded, every note I wrote became a small act of defiance. At night, I hid memory cards inside hollowed pages of old books, tucking scraps of paper into the lining of my backpack. The fear never left me. Each time Harold's voice rose, I flinched. Each time Madison smirked. I wondered if she suspected, but alongside fear was a stubborn strength. I told myself over and over, if I do not fight back, they will kill me. That mantra carried me through the days. Ethan noticed my absences at school, asking if I was all right. I lied, told him I was sick, ashamed to reveal the truth, but his concern warmed me. He wrote that he missed hearing my voice in class, that my words mattered. Late at night, I reread those messages, my bruises throbbing, and felt a flicker of hope. The contrast was cruel, yet it fueled my determination. My mother's silence cut me deepest. Sometimes she came into my room with wet eyes, whispered, "I am sorry, honey. I wish things were different." But she never acted. She was a prisoner of her own fear, locked in chains Harold had forged over years. I tried to forgive her, but each apology without action hardened something inside me. Still, I kept moving forward with my secret plan. Outwardly, I acted submissive, nodding, apologizing, completing chores without complaint. Inwardly, I documented every moment, every bruise, every word. The cage was still there, but I had started chiseling at its bars. I knew one day it would break, and when it did, I would be ready. It happened on an evening that began like any other, with Harold already drinking before dinner and the atmosphere in the house heavy with unspoken tension. I had slipped another letter into the pages of a worn paperback, a scholarship notification from a different program that promised a small sum but represented independence. I thought I had hidden it well enough, but Harold had a predator's instinct for sniffing out anything that threatened his control. He stormed into my room, the paper crumpled in his fist, eyes bloodshot and wild. "What is this?" he snarled, waving the letter like a weapon. My heart sank. My mother, Donna, stood in the kitchen doorway, her hands clutching a dish towel as if it were the only thing tethering her to the earth. "Please, Harold, let it go," she whispered, her voice shaking. He turned on her with a growl, shoving her so hard she stumbled into a chair. She did not rise, did not fight back. Madison appeared, her phone already recording her smirk wide. "This is better than TV," she murmured, steadying the camera on me. Harold's shadow loomed closer, his bulk filling my vision. "You think you can keep secrets from me, Lily?" he thundered. "You think you can take money that belongs to me, the man of this house?" His hand cracked across my face before I could answer. Pain exploded along my cheekbones, sending me sprawling. I scrambled to my knees, but his boot slammed into my ribs, forcing the air from my lungs in a sharp gasp. My vision blurred with tears, the room spinning. I tasted blood, metallic and bitter. My chest heaved as my heart pounded erratically too fast, then skipping every beat, jagged and terrifying. My body trembled as he yanked me up by the arm, shaking me until my teeth rattled. "Respect," he barked. "Respect is what you owe me." Each word punctuated with a shove that sent me crashing into the coffee table, splinters biting into my skin. My mother sobbed from the corner, begging him to stop, but her voice was a whisper against his rage. Madison's laughter echoed cruel and delighted, narrating the scene as though it were a show. I tried to crawl away, my palms scraping the carpet, but Harold's hand gripped the back of my neck, forcing me down. My heartbeat surged into chaos, then stuttered, then surged again. The air refused to enter my lungs. I clawed at the rug, desperate for oxygen, desperate to stay conscious. My vision narrowed to a tunnel, the edges darkening. In the haze, I remembered the small USB drive I had tucked into my pocket earlier. With the last of my strength, I slid it beneath the couch, hiding it in the shadows. If I did not survive this night, perhaps the evidence would. Harold's voice grew distant, distorted, like it was underwater. My mother's sobs blurred into background noise. Madison's phone hovered, capturing the collapse of my body as entertainment. My chest convulsed, every breath shallow and ragged. My heart hammered violently, then paused so long I feared it had stopped. Panic and numbness collided inside me. I tried to rise again, but my arms gave out and I collapsed sideways, cheek pressed against the coarse rug, now smeared with blood from my split lip. The world tilted. I caught one last glimpse of my mother's tear-streaked face, wide with helpless terror, before darkness pulled me under completely. It was not the soft darkness of sleep. It was the terrifying void of nothingness where even the beat of my own heart disappeared. To anyone watching, it must have looked like I had died right there on the floor, another casualty of Harold's temper. To me, it was a place beyond fear, a silence deeper than the silence I had lived in for 12 years. And in that silence, one thought burned like fire. If I survived, I would never let this happen again. When consciousness returned, it came in fragments, the smell of bourbon still heavy in the air, the faint sting of carpet burns on my cheek, the ringing echo of Harold's voice fading into memory. My ribs throbbed each time I breathed, and my throat burned raw from gasping against his grip. I lay still, afraid to move, until I realized he had left the room. My mother hovered near the doorway, her hands trembling as she placed a bottle of aspirin on the dresser, but she did not meet my eyes. She whispered that I should rest, then retreated like a ghost. I swallowed down the bitterness, not of the pills, but of her silence. Hours later, the muffled sound of Harold's rage rumbled again, this time directed at the walls, at bills, at the universe that never bent enough to his will. Then came the sharp knock at the front door, startling in its authority. Harold stiffened, his eyes narrowing. Madison peered out the window and rolled her eyes. "It is just Evelyn," she said, slipping her phone into her pocket. Our neighbor's voice carried through the thin wood. "Is everything all right in there?" I heard shouting. My breath caught. For a moment, hope flickered. Harold's face twisted into a mask of false charm as he opened the door. "Just a family matter," he said smoothly. "You know how teenagers can be." His tone dripped with practiced ease, the mask he wore for outsiders. Evelyn's sharp eyes scanned past him, lingering on the living room where I sat hunched, blood still drying on my lip. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice skeptical. Harold's shoulders stiffened, his jaw clenched, but he forced a smile. All under control, he assured her, then closed the door with a finality that crushed my fragile hope. I thought that would be the end, but later that night when the house was quiet except for Harold's snores, I found a folded piece of paper slipped beneath my bedroom door. My heart raced as I picked it up. Written in neat handwriting were 5 words: "Call me anytime, day or night." Beneath it, a phone number. It was Evelyn's. My throat tightened. For the first time in years, someone outside the house had reached in, had seen enough to act. I hid the note inside my journal, pressing it flat between the pages as if it were a sacred relic. I whispered a thank you into the darkness, though no one could hear. The next day at school, Ethan noticed the stiffness in my movements. He cornered me in the hallway, his brows furrowed. "Lily, what happened? You look like you have been through hell." I forced a laugh, brushing it off as stress, but his gaze lingered full of concern. That evening, he texted me saying if I ever needed a place to stay, I could call him. His words made my chest ache with a mixture of longing and fear. I wanted to confide in him, to spill everything, but the image of Harold's face stopped me cold. If Harold discovered I had told anyone, the retaliation would be unbearable. So I replied only with thanks, keeping my secret heavy in my chest. Still, his kindness warmed me. It reminded me I was not invisible to everyone. That week, the smallest changes began to matter. When Evelyn passed me in the yard, she gave me a look that said she knew more than she was letting on. Her gaze was not pity, it was strength, a silent promise that she was watching. I carried that with me, and when Ethan smiled at me in literature class asking if I had written anything new, I felt the ember inside me flare brighter. These were lifelines thin and fragile, but lifelines all the same. The violence had not stopped. Harold's grip had not loosened, but for the first time the cage had cracks. Someone had seen, someone had cared, and though the bruises on my ribs screamed each time I breathed hope, whispered louder, one day this would end. I began to treat every day as a battlefield where my only weapons were memory and patience. Each morning, I slipped the old phone into my pocket before heading into the kitchen, its recorder running silently. Harold's voice thundered often enough to fill hours of files. "You will pay for your brother's house," he barked one night when bills piled up though I had no brother and no money. His words made no sense except as another attempt to remind me that my life and body were currency in his control. I pressed record harder in my pocket, clinging to the idea that one day these sounds would matter. Madison joined the chorus of cruelty, snapping at me that I did not deserve my father's money, spitting the words with venom she had learned from her father. I wrote it all down in my journal, the date, the time, the insult, the bruise. I documented in detail when Harold shoved me against the fridge for forgetting to refill his glass, when Madison locked me out of the bathroom until I was late for school, when my mother whispered apologies after another night of shouting, but still looked away when Harold demanded silence. At first, the entries felt like whispers into the void, but gradually they became proof to myself that I was real, that their abuse was not imagined. I built hiding places for my evidence, hollowing out an old book to slip memory cards into, tucking scraps of paper beneath the lining of my backpack, sliding the journal into the bottom drawer under layers of clothes. Each cache felt like a secret victory. My mother noticed my bruises and sometimes muttered soft regrets. "I am sorry, honey. I wish things were different," she said, her eyes watery. But she never stood up to Harold. I saw her fear the way her shoulders curled inward when he raised his voice, the way her lips pressed together as if sealed by years of intimidation. Her silence felt like betrayal, yet I forced myself to remember she was broken too, a victim of his control. Still, her inaction cut me deeper than Harold's fists. At school, I played the role of the quiet student hiding under long sleeves, avoiding questions. Ethan's eyes often found me his kindness a lifeline. He asked if I had written anything new, and though I lied and said no inside, I clutched the truth that my notebooks were filling with words, not poems now, but records of survival. His smile gave me strength to keep writing. The nights were the hardest. Harold's pacing echoed through the halls, his drunken tirades bouncing off the thin walls. I lay awake with the recorder in my hand, its red light glowing faintly in the dark, capturing every threat, every slurred insult. Madison sometimes laughed from her room, mocking my muffled sobs. I bit down on my pillow to keep quiet. Terrified, Harold would burst through the door. Yet with each recording, I felt a small surge of control. His own words were betraying him, his voice becoming the rope that would one day hang his lies. I began to imagine escape, not the desperate fantasies of childhood, but practical steps. I pictured handing the recordings to someone who mattered, showing the journal to a judge, sliding the evidence across a table to a police officer. The thought made my chest tighten with both fear and determination. I knew discovery would mean disaster. If Harold ever found the phone, he would destroy it, and maybe destroy me too. But silence was worse. Silence was death. I had already tasted the darkness once when his hands closed around my throat. I would not let silence be the end of me, so I carried on outwardly obedient, inwardly defiant. To Harold, I remained the useless girl, the extra mouth. To myself, I became the chronicler of his tyranny. Every bruise became a line in my ledger, every threat a file on a memory card. Slowly, the balance shifted not in his eyes, but in mine. I was no longer only a victim. I was a witness, and my testimony was growing stronger every day. The cage was still there, the bars unbroken, but between the cracks, light filtered in from Evelyn's watchful eyes across the fence, and Ethan's gentle words in the classroom. Their presence reminded me that truth existed beyond Harold's lies. With every entry, every recording, every whispered vow, I prepared for the day when that truth would break free. It began with the sound of paper tearing and Harold's roar shaking the walls. He had found the deed to the house my father left behind a document I had hidden in a folder at the back of my desk. That house was the last physical piece of my father's legacy, the only thing Harold could not legally claim as his own. My hands trembled when he waved it in front of me, his face red with rage, spit flying with every word. "Sign it over Lily. This house is mine. Everything here is mine." I shook my head, fear prickling my skin, but something stronger than fear rose up from the pit of my stomach. "It is my father's gift, not yours," I said, my voice unsteady but louder than I expected. The room froze for a split second, my mother's sharp intake of breath, Madison's delighted gasp as she raised her phone to capture the explosion, and then Harold lunged. His hands found my throat again, the familiar crushing pressure cutting off my breath. My body fought for air, legs kicking uselessly against the rug. Madison giggled, whispering to her phone, "Wait until they see this." My mother stood paralyzed near the kitchen, hands pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her face but her feet glued to the floor. I tried to push Harold's hands away, but his grip tightened until stars danced in my vision. My heart skipped, staggered, then thundered painfully. I thought this was it, the night he would finally kill me. But some instinct forced my hand beneath the table, my fingers fumbling blindly until they found the edge of the USB drive I had hidden days earlier. I shoved it deeper into the shadows, praying he would not notice that if I did not survive this night, my truth might. My chest convulsed as he hurled me against the wall, the back of my head smacking plaster so hard that my vision burst into white light. I collapsed to the floor, gasping shallowly, my body curled in on itself. Harold towered above me, shouting words that dissolved into noise. Madison laughed, narrating gleefully. "Look at her! She is pathetic." My mother sobbed louder, whispering, "Please, Harold, stop, please!" But her pleas bounced off the iron wall of his fury. Then came a sound none of us expected, a pounding knock at the front door, firm and unyielding. "Mr. Carter," a voice called sharp and authoritative. "Are you all right in there?" neighbors reported, shouting. Harold stiffened his grip, loosening just enough for me to gasp a ragged breath. His face contorted as he straightened his shirt and barked at Madison to hold her tongue. He swung open the door with a forced smile, his voice dripping charm. "Just a misunderstanding, officer. Families argue." But standing there was not just the police. It was Evelyn beside them, her silver hair gleaming under the porch light, her eyes blazing with fury I had never seen before. She held a small USB drive in her hand. My heart leapt. Somehow she had found the copy I had slipped under her fence earlier that week, the desperate backup I had prayed I would never need. "I heard enough last night," Evelyn said firmly, her voice unwavering. "This girl is in danger." One of the officers stepped inside his gaze, landing on me curled on the floor, my cheeks swollen, my lips split, my ribs heaving. "Sir, what happened here?" Harold laughed, waving a dismissive hand. "She is dramatic, always trying to get attention." His tone was smooth but brittle, a mask cracking under pressure. Evelyn handed the USB to the officer. "Play it," she insisted. The officer plugged it into his laptop, and within seconds, Harold's own voice filled the room, booming and hateful. "You are nothing without me. Respect is what you owe me." The sound of a slap echoed, followed by my muffled sobs. Madison froze, her smirk faltering, her phone slipping slightly in her grip. "It is fake!" Harold shouted, but the officer's face hardened. "Sir, calm down." Harold's temper flared, and in his rage he swatted at Evelyn, but the second officer stepped forward, hand resting near his holster. At that moment, Madison's phone buzzed in her hand, the screen still recording. The officer caught sight of it and snatched it away. He pressed play, and there it was, the video of Harold's fists striking me, my body crumpling, my mother sobbing in the background while Madison laughed. The evidence spoke louder than anything I could have said. My mother collapsed into tears, covering her face. "It is true," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Everything she said is true." Her words hung heavy in the air, the dam finally breaking. Harold lunged again, but this time he was met with cold metal as the officers grabbed his arms and snapped handcuffs around his wrists. "You cannot do this," he bellowed, thrashing. "This is my house. She is mine to discipline." His voice carried no power anymore. Neighbors gathered outside, drawn by the flashing patrol lights, their murmurs rising as they watched the man who had ruled our home dragged out in chains. Madison shrieked. She provoked him. She attacked first, but her own video betrayed her, the images undeniable. She collapsed onto the sofa, sobbing hysterically. My mother shook uncontrollably, whispering prayers, but her eyes never left me wide with guilt. Evelyn knelt beside me, her hand gentle on my shoulder. "You are safe now," she said, her voice steady. I tried to believe her. My chest ached, my throat throbbed, but for the first time the cage cracked wide open. As Harold was shoved into the back of the police car, his curses muffled by the door, slamming shut, the night air filled my lungs with a clarity I had not felt in years. I clutched my backpack where my recorder was hidden, my body trembling but my spirit refusing to collapse. This was not the end I knew. It was only the beginning. The breaking point had arrived, and the pieces of truth I had gathered were finally strong enough to shatter his lies. For 12 years, Harold had been the loudest voice in our house, the shadow looming over every moment. But that night, under the harsh glow of police lights and Evelyn's unwavering gaze, his power was stripped away. The neighbors' whispers confirmed it. He was no longer the ruler of our home. He was just another criminal exposed before the world he had fooled for so long. And though my ribs burned and my heart still stuttered in uneven beats, I felt something I had nearly forgotten existed, hope that justice would finally come. The courthouse smelled of old wood and polish, its ceilings high and echoing as if every word spoken there would carry forever. I sat at the witness table, my hands trembling in my lap, a band of bruises still faint along my neck. Harold sat only a few feet away, dressed in a suit that did not hide the venom in his glare. He had once been the unshakable ruler of my home, but here his power looked hollow, reduced to the desperate anger of a man cornered. The prosecutor began by laying out the evidence. First came the audio recordings from my old phone, his voice booming across the courtroom. "You are nothing without me. Respect is what you owe me." Gasps rippled through the audience, the words undeniable. Then came the journal entries I had kept page after page of dates and times, each bruise carefully documented. The prosecutor held them up, showing the judge the detailed notes of every slap, every shove, every cruel insult. The defense attorney tried to object, claiming I was exaggerating, but the judge silenced him with a sharp look. Then came the USB. Evelyn had delivered the recording, filling the chamber with Harold's drunken tirades. My mother's sobs echoed in the background of the clips, and Madison's laughter sliced through proof of how deep the cruelty had run. Finally, the officer displayed Madison's own video, the screen enlarged on the monitor. There I was crumpled on the floor. Harold's fists raining down my mother, begging Madison smirking behind her phone. The jury watched in stunned silence, their faces pale. Madison squirmed in her seat at the back of the room, tears streaking her cheeks. When questioned, she admitted she had recorded the videos, but claimed she thought it was all a joke, that Harold was only disciplining me. The judge's eyes hardened, and Madison was ordered into a rehabilitation program for her role in enabling the abuse. When it was my turn to speak, my throat tightened, but I forced myself to rise. My voice shook at first, but then steadied. I told them about the night Harold discovered the scholarship letter, the way he had kicked me until my ribs screamed. I told them about the meals turned into punishments, about being called extra mouth, until I believed I was invisible. I described the night his hands closed around my throat so tightly that my heart stumbled, and for a terrifying second I thought it had stopped. I spoke of the fear that clung to me every day, the silence of my mother who had been too broken to defend me, the cruelty of Madison who turned my pain into spectacle. I ended by telling them why I recorded everything. Because silence was killing me, I said, my voice breaking. And I knew if I stayed silent any longer, I would not live to tell this story. The prosecutor's questions were steady and kind, allowing me to speak at my pace. The defense tried to paint Harold as a strict father, claiming I was rebellious, but the evidence shattered that narrative. The judge allowed every recording, every video, every note. Harold could not deny his own words, his own hands, his own violence captured on screen. My mother testified next, her voice trembling as she admitted through tears that she had chosen silence out of fear that Harold had convinced her she was powerless. She broke down saying she had failed me, but that she would not fail again. Her honesty pierced the courtroom, and though it hurt to hear, I knew it was part of the truth that needed to be spoken. Evelyn followed her testimony calm and unwavering. She described the years of suspicion the night she finally saw him shove me in the yard, the courage it had taken to confront him. Her steady voice contrasted sharply with Harold's outbursts, making her words ring even louder. The prosecutor detailed the financial abuse as well, explaining how the $250,000 of insurance money had been absorbed into Harold's accounts spent on liquor trucks and luxuries for Madison, while I was denied basic necessities. The numbers were cold, undeniable facts that painted greed as clearly as the bruises painted violence. Days stretched into weeks as the trial unfolded, but the pattern never changed. Each time the defense tried to twist the story, another piece of evidence shattered it. By the closing arguments, the weight of proof was suffocating. I sat there, my heart beating steadily for once listening as the prosecutor told the jury that this was not discipline, not family conflict, but calculated control, physical assault, financial exploitation, and attempted murder. When the jury left to deliberate, the silence in the courtroom was heavy. My stomach twisted, every muscle tense. My mother gripped my hand tightly, whispering prayers. Ethan sat behind me, his presence quiet but steady, his eyes never leaving mine. After only a few hours, the jury returned. The foreman stood, his voice steady as he read the verdict. Guilty on all counts: domestic violence, financial abuse, attempted murder. The words landed like thunder, final and unshakable. Harold erupted, shouting curses at me, at Evelyn, at the officers, but his voice was drowned by the clink of chains as guards restrained him. The judge's gavel struck sharp and echoing, announcing his sentence of many years in prison. My chest loosened with each word, as if the gavel itself had broken the chains that had bound me for 12 long years. My mother wept openly, not from sorrow, but from release. Madison sobbed too, her tears laced with confusion, her smirk gone. Evelyn squeezed my shoulder gently, whispering, "You did it." Ethan leaned forward and whispered words I would never forget. "Your heart did not fail that night, Lily. It just started beating for yourself." As Harold was led away, his voice reduced to a hollow echo. I realized that for the first time, the loudest voice in the room was mine. I had told my story. I had been heard, and justice had answered. After the trial ended, the days felt strangely weightless, as if the heavy air that had filled my lungs for years had finally lifted. I left the courthouse with bruises fading and scars still tender, but for the first time in my life, I was not walking back into Harold's cage. Evelyn insisted I stay with her, and her small home felt like stepping into another world. The scent of lavender and lemon lingered in every room, and she kept the porch light on each night so I would never feel alone in the dark. At first, I slept fitfully, waking from nightmares drenched in sweat, hearing Harold's voice echoing in my ears. Each time, Evelyn appeared at my door in her robe, carrying a mug of warm tea, sitting with me until my breathing slowed. Slowly, my body began to learn what safety felt like. Ethan visited often, sometimes with flowers, sometimes with books, sometimes with nothing but his quiet presence. One evening, he read aloud from a collection of poems, his voice steady and warm, and something in my chest unclenched. For years, I had been told my words were worthless, but hearing him treat poetry like treasure reminded me that the pieces of myself Harold had tried to erase still existed. I began to write again, not only in secret journals, but on a small blog I created anonymously. I poured my story into the screen, the manipulation, the violence, the small acts of resistance. To my surprise, people found it. Comments trickled in from strangers who said they too had lived in houses ruled by fear, who said my words gave them courage. I read those messages with tears on my cheeks, realizing that the silence that had nearly killed me could now be broken into something that helped others. My mother started attending therapy, encouraged by the hospital social worker. She called often, her voice fragile, admitting she had failed me, begging for a chance to rebuild. At first, I could not answer. Anger still pulsed under my skin, the memory of her frozen figure in the kitchen doorway while Harold's fists landed on me, too raw to forgive. But eventually I picked up, listening as she cried, listening as she promised she wanted to change. My heart felt torn, caught between fury and longing, but I agreed to meet her halfway. Healing would not come in a single day, but perhaps it could come in steps. Madison was sent into a rehabilitation program, and though part of me burned with resentment for her laughter as I suffered, another part pitied her. She had been shaped by Harold's poison taught that cruelty was love. I could not excuse what she had done, but I could hope that distance from him might give her a chance to grow into someone better. Meanwhile, Evelyn became like family, fussing over my bandages, teaching me recipes, reminding me that kindness was not weakness, but strength. Ethan's presence deepened quietly, his hand brushing mine as he passed me a pen, his eyes meeting mine with steady patience. He never pushed, never demanded, just reminded me through small gestures that I mattered. The bruises faded from my skin, but the scars inside took longer. Sometimes I caught myself flinching at sudden noises, my pulse racing. Sometimes I woke with Harold's voice still ringing in my head. But each time I grounded myself with a pen in my hand, with Evelyn's tea, with Ethan's gentle encouragement. I realized healing was not a single event, but a collection of small moments strung together, each one building a life beyond survival. For the first time in years, I began to imagine a future not defined by Harold's shadow, but by my own choices. When Harold was finally locked away and the courtroom closed its doors behind him, the world outside felt both foreign and new. He was no longer the ruler of my house, no longer the voice that dictated every breath I took. He was just another prisoner behind bars, stripped of the authority he had stolen. Madison remained in a rehabilitation program, and though the thought of her laughter while I bled still haunted me, I hoped distance and guidance might break the cycle Harold had forged. My mother began working part-time, slowly reclaiming pieces of herself she had long surrendered. Each paycheck she earned without Harold's oversight seemed to stitch a thread of dignity back into her spine. She still carried guilt, still begged for forgiveness, but she was trying. That mattered more than silence. As for me, I returned to the house my father had left behind, the house Harold had tried to force from me. The locks were changed, the walls scrubbed of his stench, the rooms filled with flowers Evelyn had planted in jars. I opened windows and let sunlight pour into corners that had known only shadows. I sat at the kitchen table where Harold had once mocked my writing and filled notebooks with stories again, no longer hiding them under floorboards but stacking them proudly. I planted roses in the yard, each bloom a declaration that life would grow where violence once reigned. Ethan often sat on the porch with me, reading aloud lines of poetry or simply holding my hand in silence. His presence reminded me daily that gentleness existed, that kindness was not weakness but strength. My mother visited often, helping plant new flowers, sometimes crying quietly as she apologized. I listened, not ready to erase the past, but willing to build a fragile bridge toward the future. Evelyn became like family, her home always open, her wisdom steady. The blog I had started in whispers grew into something larger. Survivors from across the country wrote to me, sharing their own stories of silence and survival. They told me my words gave them courage to seek help, to leave, to speak. Each message reminded me that my pain had not been wasted, that telling the truth had power. One evening, as I watered the roses, I whispered to my father, gone so long but still with me. He tried to choke the life out of me, I said softly. But he failed. Justice gave me breath again, and now my story is mine. For the first time in years, my heart beat steady, not frantic or broken, but alive with purpose. And as I closed my laptop after publishing another post, I added a message to anyone reading, to anyone listening. If you have ever witnessed someone silenced by family, if you have ever felt erased in your own home, know this. Silence does not save you. Speaking, even when your voice shakes, can bring light into the darkest corners. Share your story. We heal together.